the first of many years to come. Again, thanks to the generous support of USAID in order to make this happen. I hope you all enjoyed the panels. I was able to sort of float around to several, and I got quite captivated by the one with Arwa, who's still here, and the other female journalists talking about the role of journalism in humanitarian response. So it's now my honor, really a distinct honor, to welcome back Jan Egeland to CSIS. He's going to deliver our closing keynote. Jan has been a Norwegian diplomat. He's held multiple senior UN positions. You can read his bio in the program, I won't do that. But for the last 6 years, he's been leading the Norwegian Refugee Council. His compassion really began early in life. I did a lot of digging about you, Jan. He started working with Amnesty International when he was in high school, and he moved to Colombia when he was 19 to work on social justice issues. And for 4 decades since, he really has been a dedicated advocate and global humanitarian leader to advocate for those who are suffering from conflict and injustice. And just a reminder that that's, of course, why we're all here and doing what we do. We're in this wonderful, privileged, beautiful building of DC, but the reason we are having these conversations are to improve the lives of those who are suffering. So, Jan, from working on the Oslo Peace Accords to working at the forefront of the crisis in Syria, Jan has been there working on some of the most complex humanitarian crises throughout his career. He speaks a lot to press and policymakers about how aid can more effectively reach the most vulnerable, and we're so thankful that we now get to hear from him. Jan, thank you for your lifetime of leadership and service, and thank you for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Kimberly. Very happy to be here back in CSIS. And thanks for putting together this report, this task force, and for having a humanitarian program. Because we, as humanitarians, need friends these days who can help promote our principles, help us in a critical period in the history of humanitarian work. And in the United States, we need efforts that can build continued bipartisanship on supporting us as we try to reach people in their hour of greatest need in the worst places on the planet. So I will, in my presentation, what do I thought, no, I do this. How do I?
Okay, we'll get you some help.
This is the one? Okay, how do I get it? Oops, okay, too much. Yeah. My response to your points, denial, delay, and diversion, which you found in your report, and which I and we in the Norwegian Refugee Council can fully subscribe to and verify, is basically that we as humanitarians need to be even stronger in defending our principles, do more to protect people, and do even more to be close to them, to have proximity to people in great need by being there in the deep field. So I've reflected also of late, so what's different now compared to when I started 40 years ago? Because each generation of humanitarian workers feel that we are uniquely challenged. It's never been worse. It's never been tougher, the attacks on us or the civilians we defend. You know, if you see violence-wise, it was equally bad in 1990. It was worse. I mean, that was the age of the genocides. we were also, as humanitarian workers in the Balkans, in Rwanda, during these genocides, attacked as much as we were today. The reason the number is even higher now is that there were many more humanitarian workers in places exposed than ever before. But what is new, and what I can subscribe to in the report, is that we've never had as many intrusive governments. We've never had as many authorities either trying to deny us access or throw us out of countries. And we've never had so many laws by so many donor countries that have made it so difficult for us to really stay and deliver in some of the worst places. And I will therefore be concrete on that and address counterterrorism legislation at the end. So again, we did two reports also in where the Norwegian Refugee Council did a report called Presence and Proximity, and it built on a report that I did with the United Nations in 2012 called To Stay and Deliver. The basic finding here, which you verified in your report, is that there are 500, 600, 700 international organizations who can go anywhere in the world now to meet, for example, a major natural disaster. So it is therefore strange that when you go to many of the toughest conflict zones with a lot of needs, there are 2, 3, 4, or 5 groups there who are able to stay and deliver, who are willing to take the risk, who have the investment to do risk management, and who have the guts actually to risk all of the possible consequences of the zero tolerance now of donors and others. I went to North Kivu last year. This was just before Ebola broke out. The number of people displaced by violence in North Kivu with 140 armed groups had doubled over the last 2 years. And the number of humanitarian groups able to stay and deliver there had been halved in the same period. This was for Ebola, which also explained why we were so ill-prepared when Ebola broke out. So there are few actors present in insecure areas, and too many have to resort to remote programming, and there is a risk transfer to many of these of the groups that are left to deliver, and many of them are local. Now, we therefore need to rekindle the humanitarian principles. I mean, the humanitarian principles really were born out of the Geneva Conventions, Henri Dunant, the Battle of Solferino, and we have survived time and again the attacks of armies, of groups, of tyrants and terrorists by being impartial, neutral, independent, and only there to promote humanity. Too few groups invest enough, in my view, on teaching all of their staff to live by and through these principles. If we do not live by them, we are much, much less able to withstand the attacks of the political groups, of the governments, or of the non-state armed entities. Now, of course, if we are to continue to work in Idlib, which is now the place in northwestern Syria that you know the highest number of human lives are at present at stake. I mean, there are 3 million civilians in the Idlib area, and there is no effective diplomacy to avoid this the final and worst battle of the worst war of our generation. Now, if we're there to stay and deliver, we need to be able to live by these principles, because the de facto authorities are groups that are listed by the United States and most other of our donors as terrorists. And those attacking are the Assad government with Russia and Iran. Which again also shows that, of course, even more than assistance in this area, it is protection that people need. I mean, these young teenagers driving through those ruins to their homes, which presumably still are standing, they don't primarily need another blanket. They need the war to not come to their place. And here's my point again on protection. We've seen now 40 years of continuous, I've seen that firsthand, continuous progress in assistance. We're doing things we couldn't dream of 20 years ago now. We do, high-altitude airdrops from 6,000 meters, the World Food Programme being fantastic in that. We're doing disease control that is beyond belief at the moment. But how come we're still, in a way, accepting that the way to liberate a city like Mosul is to destroy it, and the way to save a population is to have them flee for their lives? Protection is the area where we as humanitarians are failing the most, in my view, because we're not closer in getting armed actors, getting politicians, decision makers to understand civilians have to be protected, irrespective of who is in control, irrespective of the circumstances. Now, humanitarian diplomacy is therefore something we need to focus much more on. And here the report from CSIS is very right. I saw that firsthand when I was the UN Special Advisor for Syria on humanitarian access and protection of civilians, and I worked closely with the UN envoy, political envoy on Syria. This is a photo of the coming out of the humanitarian task force that we had every week, then every second week, with Russia, Iran, Turkey, the Gulf countries, the US, the other P5 powers, all of the countries that had influence in Syria sat around the table. For a period, we succeeded in opening up besieged areas for the first convoys ever to these places. We were able to have Russian military, American military, US, Russian diplomats, Iranians, etc., to help us to negotiate access to places where 5, 6, 7 rebel groups had to subscribe to it, and all of the entities of an incoherent Assad military machine as well. And it led to people getting assistance, and it also led to de-escalation zones that kept the war away from areas like Idlib for a long time. And then, in the end, that humanitarian diplomacy faltered, and as so much else did in the Syria war. My point being that it was possible to succeed when all of those countries that brought fuel to this fire for once sat down and said, let's at least shield the civilians, let us at least get support to the civilians. This kind of humanitarian diplomacy happens very seldom. It is possible to do. It has to be strengthened. There is no such thing now, for example, in Yemen, and it's not working anymore, it seems, in Syria at the hour of greatest need in Idlib. Now, regarding proximity, These are my colleagues in a place called Uruzgan in Afghanistan. NRC is the only organization in the entire province there. You cannot reach it by road because of Taliban having cut all of the roads. It's only by small airplanes you can go there. These are our local staff who work with and for the displaced. Very proud, very well trained, very effective. Local families are most conservative religiously and so on areas of Afghanistan. We can be there, we can deliver, but the cost is in many ways astronomical, and the risk to our people is really too high. Still, I think we need help from donors, from diplomats, from actors to enable proximity even in places like Uruzgan. So, ending, just a word on counterterrorism measures, because it's been an important part of your report and also of the discussion today. This is taking more and more of my time. This is something that is more and more difficult for me and my colleagues as we try to stay and deliver in the worst areas. A couple of examples. The designation of Hezbollah's political wing, not the military one, which I perhaps could understand, but the political will as a terrorist organization is a major blow to potential blow to our humanitarian work in Lebanon. What is this? This is the cabinet of Lebanon. Lebanon, close partner, ally, country, the United States, the West, the European Union, etc., wants to help survive as a nation. Who's the terrorist on this photo of men in their 50s, 60s, and 70s in the cabinet? Well, it's this one. He's the health minister of Lebanon. We cannot not deal with the political wing of Hezbollah because they're in the cabinet, they're all over southern Lebanon, they're a major political force, they have people all over. That is Lebanon today. Now, Afghanistan is another example. We're the biggest international NGO in Iran, NRC. And we're there to help Afghan refugees. There are 3 million Afghan refugees in Iran. Iran has been one of the most generous receiving nations in the world for refugees. Afghans can work there, they get free education, they get free health care, but there are many, many vulnerable. We try to help them. Now, since June of last year, it's been virtually impossible to get any bank to transfer any money to humanitarian work in Iran. We've spent hundreds of thousands of euros extra on legal studies, on legal advice, to make it clear to banks that it is perfectly all right to transfer money, and still no bank would risk transferring because they're so afraid of the US sanctions. So it took really a year for the first bank to be able to transfer something, and it was really very cumbersome. Apart from that, it has been the Hawala system, private companies, less secure, more costly, to get aid from the European Union, from Germany, from Sweden, from Norway, to Afghan refugee children in Iran. Beneficiary vetting is, of course, one of the things which is a red line for us as humanitarians. We vet, according to terrorism lists, all staff. We do it ourselves, all partner organizations, all suppliers, everybody we have a commercial or financial relationship with against the list. We do not vet beneficiaries. We will not ask this widow whether her dead husband was a member of Boko Haram, or whether she has the views of the organization. We ask her, do you and your children have needs? And if the answer is yes, and we can verify that, she will get assistance. But it is not absolutely clear that we will one day be found guilty of being in association with a listed group by providing assistance to people who may hold the views or even some kind of a membership of a listed group. So I'm ending with a couple of recommendations, really, and then I'd like us to discuss it. We need a better dialogue between governments, including our donor governments, the private sector, which includes banks, insurance company, even ambulance plane companies who, for example, are now scared to deal with Iran because of the sanctions, and us in the humanitarian organizations. We need a frank dialogue, because our assumption is that nobody wants to hurt Afghan refugee girls, or for that matter, Palestinian boys and girls in Gaza. It is in the US interest, in Israel's interest, that we provide some hope to children in Gaza, where Hamas is in control completely. And we cannot not deal with the de facto authorities. We need dialogue. Then we need very clear humanitarian exemptions. There is an exemption now that seems very clear and good for me on assistance to Venezuela in the US, an exemption for our work. We're a big actor within Venezuela for Venezuelans in great need. There is no such commensurate exemption for Iran. There is some exemption, but it's not anywhere close for us to be able to transfer money even to our work there. Then we need to be better ourselves to provide guidance for field staff who are scared. Will I be held accountable for material support to a listed organization by actually doing my work for the people in the area where the listed organization is in control? So finally, I need a help desk, really. A help desk in governments. I've discussed that now recently, well, here in Washington, in London, in Stockholm, and in Bern. Bern, because of Swiss banking being so important. And the confirmation is no one wants to make it, to sabotage my work for refugee children. But no one is able so far to tell me, you do it exactly this way, and if you do it exactly this way, you will not, nor your staff, be in violation of any of our rules, and that is very clear with all parts of all of the governments that you will be held accountable to. That's what I need, and then we can continue to expand work for those in greatest need. Thank you.
Rekindle humanitarian principles. I'm curious if you think, and this might be really unfair because it's a hard question, but which of the principles do you think is being most attacked right now, or people are disregarding it the most? Is there one that stands out to you?
Well, I think it is the independence one, and potentially the neutrality one. Mm-hmm. Syria has not been, in my view, a good experience for the humanitarian community. Too many organizations ended up either in government-controlled areas or in opposition-controlled areas, And that colored the way they worked and did their operations, and the way they thought of the other side. We have been able, hanging on by our fingernails on both sides, to work both in government-controlled areas and in opposition-controlled areas. But most organizations were not allowed that, or were not able to do that. And then mutual suspicions, organizations also being politicized and so on, was not good for our collective work. The independence one is perhaps most difficult by many of the local groups who are under enormous pressure, and therefore they need us to shield them, to support them, to guide them, and also tell them that the humanitarian principle is you don't support any one of the groups or any one of the government of the government entities. Typically, Afghanistan and Iraq, too many organizations became operator on behalf of the government, or even the Western, state-building plans, and that also hurt independent humanitarian work, as we now have to deal with armed opposition groups and so on, who are in war with the government.
Mm-hmm. You've said a lot that we need political solutions, of course, to end conflicts, and that those responsible for finding those solutions are powerful, well-fed men in suits and uniforms. Mm-hmm. I love that quote. But I'm going to shift it a little. What are those powerful men, I'm going to add, and women? What do they need to know about today's crises in terms of how do we go from war to peace? What is it that you think those powerful men and women need to know?
Well, number one, also how important they are, what kind of responsibility they have for the civilian population. Well, I use that very often in my work on Syria, where I was attacked a lot by, the Russian military and press conference in Moscow by the Assad government. Also by some of the smaller political groups in the opposition, for basically being very blunt, that I couldn't really see that the armed men really
in that case, yes.
mostly men with tie and men with uniform there were doing their utmost to maximize their own influence at the expense of the civilian population. It was very clear that the government was willing to starve an entire encircled city, because it was less costly for them to starve the entire city than to fight out with the 10,000 armed men inside, street by street, basement by basement. That's the point of that. That's the military perverse logic of besiegement. But I don't think it's either a very romantic thing for men with beards in Idlib to be willing to fight for their extremist ideology to the last baby and the last pregnant woman in their community. There's nothing romantic about that either. So I think we can be pretty blunt when we defend the rights of the civilians.
How blunt can you be about the U.S. government? Meaning, what's your message towards U.S. policymakers about its role in terms of being a global humanitarian leader, and then specifically about the current political climate we have with our President Donald Trump? What thoughts do you have? I mean, you've been in this for a long time, so you've seen an ebb and flow, right, of different U.S. leaders, but how do you think we're doing right now?
Well, I think we can be pretty blunt. Actually, number one, I expected, actually, humanitarian funding to be going dramatically down during this administration, as it has also several times promised to cut funding. Congress has kept it up, so the United States is still by far the biggest donor for humanitarian work in the world. And that is important. And it's really more or less in the entire world, really. Still, also in parenthesis, I mean, the US taxpayer can be told, I think, that the Norwegian taxpayer doesn't pay twice as much, but more than 5 times more out of their tax money to foreign assistance. So does the Swedes, by the way. What is really bad is what I think we will see now when I will go with Joel and Camilla tomorrow to El Salvador and travel the migrant route by car. We will not walk. We will drive from San Salvador through Guatemala and through southern Mexico, end up in Mexico City. You know, we will see that this administration has phenomenally counterproductively cut aid to El Salvador and Honduras at the same time as they are denying asylum to people who flee, you know, horrific violence, organized violence.
Yeah.
It's the end of the right of asylum, really, from this part on the southern border of the United States, which is it's not a new concept. It's a 2,000-year-old concept. Baby Jesus sought asylum in Egypt and got it. Baby Jesus would not get it if he came with Mary and Joseph to your border with Mexico, actually. So, and the other point is, we're saying you are saying in a way, not you, Kimberly, your government is saying to El Salvador and Honduras, says youth, we will, as we seal the border, not provide any hope for a better future where you are. Don't come here. We will not give you asylum, and we will not help you with education, employment, hope for the future. NRC is not getting any of funding for very good programming in Central America is from the European Union, from Sweden, from Norway. So I think there is some hypocrisy here, to put it rightly.
Yeah. We're going to have only time for probably one round of questions from the audience, so don't hold on to it. Be brave, raise your hand high, and let's see what questions we have for Jan. Let's start over here with the woman holding her hand in the light jacket. Yeah, thanks, Hannah. And as always, stand, give your name, organization. Yes, thank you.
Hi, Lauren from Center for Civilians in Conflict. Glad to have the chance to hear your thoughts today. I would be keen to get your thoughts as well on the tensions, if you see that there are tensions, between the drive to rekindle humanitarian principles and the increasing emphasis on the humanitarian nexus, or the nexus between humanitarian peace building and development. And if you see tensions there, then where you think the opportunities are for overcoming the tensions between those two agendas.
I have a very similar question on my card that I regret I couldn't get to. So thanks for asking that. Let's come ahead and come right over here.
Hi, thank you. Jo Reed from CARE. Just picking up on some of the comments that you were making about the challenges in Iran with the sanctions regime now. And I'm interested to hear your perspective, given the challenges that we faced in Somalia and in Sudan with exactly these types of restrictions, both in the 2011 drought, the more recent El Nino, and in Sudan, and the engagement that we've been doing with banks pretty much continuously for the past 5 years on some of the issues that you raised today. And I'm wondering if you think the fact that these are being experienced now in Yemen, now in Iran, areas where perhaps there's more political focus, do we have the opportunity to go beyond these contexts and address the challenges that we've been facing? I mean, you mentioned Gaza, but we've been relying on Western Union and Dahab Shale to be able to continue doing humanitarian work in the Horn of Africa for most of the past decade. And so I wonder how you see the current constraints with a view to the ongoing restraints that we've had, as banks see that regardless of how much information we give them about how not to get fined $3 billion, it just doesn't make business sense for them to have to work in these environments when they can do business elsewhere. And there's not really a competition to work in the kind of communities like Somalia and Sudan. Obviously, the situation is changing in Sudan, but it seems very connected to what you were talking about in Syria and Iran. And so is there a holistic way we can address this?
Great. Let's take one more last question. We'll come right over here. Yeah, right here. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you very much. My name is Mindy Reiser. I'm vice president of an NGO called Global Peace Services USA. I'd like your thoughts about the future of humanitarian assistance from China and from Russia. China has been doing a lot in developing worlds, but it's tied to trade and future economic possibilities for the Chinese government and entrepreneurs. And I know very little about Russian aid.
Good question. That's interesting.
Yeah, well, maybe take that first. China and Russia is not really contributing to our global humanitarian response appeals. And it's a shame, really. Nor does many of the other big Asian economies. It's really Japan and to some extent Korea has come on board. Apart from that, it is the usual suspects. It's 10 Western countries who we rely on. And I keep telling when I go around that, to many countries that when my country was half as rich as yours, we gave 1% of GDP to foreign assistance, and you get nothing, really. We're struggling in the humanitarian world, actually, to free ourselves from being sort of a Western kind of a project. Most of the organizations are Western-based origin, and the donors are also Western, too much. China is a major investor in bilateral development, infrastructure. You go all over Africa and you see, chances are that the parliament, the biggest football field, the harbor, the railway and the highway is Chinese built now. And is that at times in the Western say, and of course it's completely immoral that they do that because the strings attached and so on. Well, actually, for many of these countries, it's pretty significant. But there are strings attached, really. Russia is much more in their neighborhoods, and it's much more military. Russia is really a huge military force, as you know, in Syria. They are not. They are much less than China, or into development work elsewhere, and they are unfortunately not giving much at all to UN or NGO humanitarian work. Which ties perhaps a little bit to the nexus between humanitarian work, which is governed by the principles, developmental work, which is often there to help governments build themselves and structures and the state, and peace-building work, which is often can be pretty political because it tries to strike a compromise on political agendas where parties are fighting each other. I am not so afraid that we will be polluted as we try to seek, actually, I be very open here, we try to seek World Bank funding. We get now funding from the German Development Bank in Lebanon, in Iraq, and elsewhere. Considerable money from the German Development Bank. It's 100% on our turf in terms of priorities and principles. We would never, ever take it if it tried to steer us into a state-building program or something that would be owned by or associated with a political government. But we need to be defending that as humanitarians, and I've seen too many humanitarians who have taken funding that is too close to military and strategic and political goals. Perhaps just a comment then, also inspired by your intervention on also the U.S. Where should the U.S. Western governments give money and where should they invest their diplomacy? Money-wise, I wish they would give it really according to needs and needs alone. That's what we ask for, that's what we want. That's the principle of impartiality. Unfortunately, there is clearly agendas behind many countries, including the US, investing more in the places where there is a strategic interest to stabilize the situation. Central America, the only logical thing would be to have a major program there, so that defies logic to not spend money on it. Actually, Europe now spends a lot of money in Northern Africa because Europe is very afraid of the migration into the Mediterranean. We criticize some of that money not going after needs, but after stabilization, which is often at the premise of a security logic that can be counter to our humanitarian objectives. So that's money should go after needs. Diplomacy should really go after where you are effective. And I forgot to say that in my introduction. You know, too often I meet US diplomats and so on who really wants to discuss with me Syria and places where the US actually at the moment very limited influence. Syria, I want to discuss with Russia, Turkey, and Iran, primarily, and then Gulf. US could have influence via the Gulf, really, on Idlib. US has influence on Yemen because it's so close to Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is really it in terms of the bombing of Yemen. US is the only one who can influence Israel. And Israel is the place that is determining what is happening in Gaza, really. Controlling the borders of Egypt also in the south. So US needs to understand that we will rely on them in defending humanitarian principles in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in the Yemen context, in Central America, in the Caribbean, in trying to seek a political settlement around Venezuela, not a military one. That's the US. And then Russia is really Syria. Russia has a deep responsibility for what's happening and what's not happening in terms of defending civilians in Syria. So I think that ending here with a invitation to CSIS, try to get diplomats to work on where they have influence and not to go into an endless seminar on the places where they have very little influence.
That's good advice. I think to end, there's all of these it's pretty heavy topics, you know. It can sometimes feel a little daunting when we think about the number of people in need. Where are there places where you feel there's hope? Where's some positive glimmers that kind of keep you going?
Listen, there are many. When I joined the United Nations in 2003, there were horrific wars in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Ivory Coast. East Timor was really still under horrific Portuguese rule. It was not that far away from Cambodia being a place of only misery. You go back a little bit more, and Mozambique and Angola would be, of course, still, torn to pieces through colonial wars. So there is a lot of places that became much better. So I was really a very much of an optimist when I left the United Nations in 2005-06. I must admit that I'm more pessimistic now again, but the places I mentioned are infinitely better off than they were when they were at war. The problem now is that the wars that are ongoing are not ending, and the prospect of them ending is is less. But let me also end by saying humanitarian work is more effective than ever. I'm seeing that. We're reaching more people in a more effective and efficient way than ever before. Mortality, morbidity is down. Disease control is up. Education, even in war zones, is up. Assistance is better. Protection is the area where we need to be devoting much more resources.
Thank you so much, Jan, and thank you to our audience too for your engagement, your presence, your questions. Thank you to those who've been watching online. Let's give a round of applause for Jan.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.